So, Glenda, it's always nice to see you, and I really enjoy our conversations. So, thank you.
I do too, Barrett. It's a fun chance to talk with you and to find out more about Spryng and how it works. So that's really great. So,
Yeah.
of course, I'm always full of questions, but my first question for you today is how does it work? So, who comes to Spryng and why and how? And I'm just really curious about how a project, like a project life, why do they come? Why,
Yeah.
what kinds of problem would bring
Well,
someone to
it,
Spryng?
it's a really good question, and typically, the reason an institution, it could be a private company, a government, an NGO, across the whole spectrum of organizations, they have some sort of issue that's typically a problem for them. Typically, it's a problem that's been intractable, that's been difficult. It's one that typically they've been dealing with for a long time, one way or the other. And they come to the place where they say, we need to figure out what's going on here. And typically they've tried other approaches and other things, and they stumble onto, or for whatever reason, they learn about active sense making, this way of gaining insights into complex human systems at scale. And they present like myself, a consultant or practitioner of active sense making. They present them with a question. We want to understand, and some of the projects that I was thinking of relative to this conversation, we want to understand how do customers become loyal to us as a business? What's the source of that? Obvious, important question for lots of businesses. And or what? How are in a government organization? How is leadership being experienced in our public service organization? Which often comes about because they've been hearing reports of uneven experiences of leadership, and they're saying we need to do something to raise the standards or deal with these issues, but we're curious, how are people experiencing leadership, and how can we figure that out? And so there's a question. It starts with curiosity. There's a question about something that's important to them as an organization. And sometimes it's about health. There's a lot of projects that have been done in the field of health. There's a lot of projects that have been done in social services, government services, but also businesses and customer service, employee engagement, any of these large sort of complex challenges where there's you feel like there's a need to do better, but we're not sure what we can do that will make a difference.
Well, and it's so exciting, Barrett, because in all of those cases, it's about what are people thinking,
Exactly.
right? So it's not all kinds of complex questions, all kinds of complex problems. It's what are people thinking, and not what's an average of a group thinking. So you don't want the average of the group, but you want to know what individual subjective truths are within a collective group.
Exactly. Yeah, well said.
And so it's so interesting that you need to know how an individual is processing information, responding to service, seeing a possibility. But each one is going to be unique because their experience is different. So, how do you hold that possibility of knowing each individually and all at the same time? Like
And
it's an interesting path into a normative truth, isn't it?
it is, and of course that is the challenge, and if I can say, that's the magic of the methodology, or the genius of the methodology, that it's designed in a way that says every voice matters, every human experience is unique, and every human experience, every human opinion about whatever it is based on experiences that they've had, and then they form opinions or
Mhm.
judgments about that. And so we want to know, what were those experiences, and then how did they make sense of those experiences? The first thing that we do, once we understand what the curiosity is about, we design some questions where we're inviting respondents, whoever the people who are impacted by this, influencers and influenced by, in the system, whatever it is, as many as possible. We want to invite them to share experiences. And we do that by inviting them, by designing what we call prompting questions. And a prompting question is to invite somebody to share a concrete, specific experience that they've had relative to the question. So for example, I can read you one here. So a project where individuals, groups that are involved in providing humanitarian care for people who have been displaced, refugees, and what has been their experience of working with international NGOs? What has been their experience of providing care in partnership with larger organizations that are trying to help local leaders? Here's one of the prompting questions. Think about decision-making power and resources needed for a just and equitable response to a humanitarian crisis and or displacement. So they're encouraged to think about that. Share an experience you have had or witnessed where local stakeholders were in charge or where outside actors had the power. What happened? Now you can see what's happening. That's an ambiguous question. It could be a positive experience, it could be a negative experience. It could be one where local people were in charge or outside people were in charge. But it's a context where there's that interplay. What experience did you have? And so prompting questions are always slightly ambiguous. As one person said, if a person can read a prompting question and say, oh, that's the kind of answer they want, it's not a good prompting question.
Yeah. It's interesting because it gives, there's so many variables there. So I can imagine one of those people would have 20 stories.
Absolutely.
And so in that moment, they can say one, and then that may make them think of another and another. So it's not just then that that person's experience is unique, but you capture a unique moment
Right.
and response to that moment in a unique person's experience. And so it really, that prompting question, really the more concrete, I suspect you get it, the more applied, the more particular, the easier it would be for people to give really meaningful and unique responses.
And they are unique. One of the differences between this and, say, a traditional survey is we invite people to share more than one experience. So if you, as you say, I'm reminded of other experiences, and always with the instrument, it says, if you have another experience, please share as many experiences as you would like to share. But each time you share an experience, you share one, and then you answer some questions about that experience. So you're interpreting, you're assigning some meaning to that. Here's another one for the one we were doing with for an education department about inclusive and special education. And one of the questions, and there's always a choice of questions, so there's usually 3 or 4 different questions that are slightly different, so that hopefully one of them is of interest or hooks to the respondent. Think of a time when the teacher or other support people were helpful and engaged with a student and or family and or community, or were not helpful or disengaged. What happened? Okay, so again, you can answer, there's no right or wrong answer, and we tend to push people to the extremes because the really interesting experiences are the ones that are on one end or the other, and then they can interpret those things. So we're inviting, and the thesis behind that is that every voice matters, every experience matters. You can think about it in terms of customer loyalty and similar, prompting questions around what happened, some experience that you had with a company that made you want to keep shopping there or decide that you would never shop there again.
It's another really interesting aspect to the questions is that they're evaluative. So they're not just reporting, nor are they opinions necessarily, but it's telling the story that made you feel something. And so, or that prompted you to feel something. And it's an evaluative thing, which is really interesting because usually when you provide information on a survey or something, even in an interview, it's very often just descriptive. This is what happened to me. What happened to you? But this is so much richer because you're talking about not just what happened, because you ask for that to keep it grounded, but What was your response to that? How did it affect you? What did
Yeah.
you, so are they always that kind of an evaluative layer in them?
They always push to the borders, if you will, the boundaries of whatever the question is, and typically that is evaluative. I suppose it could have you could think of it in other ways, but it's pushing you to think of the exemplar experiences
Mhm.
along whatever the scale might be. And because those are the ones that are interesting to people. And you think about it, that's how we naturally do stuff. When 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 I ask you how your day went, you don't say, "Well, I got up and I brushed my teeth and and then I put on my clothing and whatever it is." We say, "Well, today, boys, it was a hard day because I had to do this," or "It was a great day. This thing
Mhm.
happened." So that's a natural way that we
Yeah.
we we think of our
Mm.
experiences in life, and so we're inviting
Yeah.
people to.
Going through that selection process.
Yeah, exactly. And those are and we're doing that because we're making sense of our day. I mean, we're actually when we think about it, when I say how'd your day go, the answer that you give me is you're telling me an experience, and the experience that you're giving me is one that's going to help me understand how you are experiencing your day, as opposed to simply saying, "Well, I brushed my teeth and then I ate my breakfast," or vice versa. And to me,
Well,
that's
and
a
it's,
very natural human way of how we make sense of the world.
yeah, that's true. That makes sense. And I think that it's such a critical reflection of what we talk about as adaptive action. It's not just what you saw,
Hmm.
but so what did it mean to you? Because it's in that that things get stored away. It's not the thing that happened that you remember. It's the response and the so what, the implication, the connections that really capture a memory.
Yep.
Um, and that would also be the memory that your client would have wanted to know when they're trying to figure out a variety of individual perspectives. How do you decide on a good question?
Oh, it's an art and a science. The deriving really good prompting questions, and as I say, there's typically at least two or three, maybe four. Don't want too many, but at least a couple, so people can think. A number of doors into whatever the big question is. But typically, uh, it involves a process where uh, people who are either influencers or influenced by people who have some involvement in whatever the question is, but involvement not just as people who are in charge necessarily. You're trying to be as broadly representative as possible of the population who would be naturally interested, naturally involved with, naturally impacted by whatever the issue is, whatever the question is. And you bring together a representative group of them, and there might be, I've done it with as few as 10 or 12, depends on how big the issue is. I've done it with multiple workshops of 15 or 20 people. In those workshops, we're inviting people to uh, think about whatever the question is and asking them what are questions that come to mind. Actually, uh, pattern spotters is not a bad little exercise to put people to. When I think of this question, these are things that come to mind. And we're just generating what's bubbling to the surface in their thinking around those. And then we look at
Yeah.
what they come up with, and we're looking at the patterns in that. We invite them to reflect on those patterns, and are there themes? Do they notice any themes in the patterns that they've identified? And then from noticing those things, we're looking for what we sometimes call modulators. We're looking for the things that seem to be where the hinges are for how people are asking questions, how they're uh, responding to the challenges that they're wrestling with. And out of that, we start crafting p- prompting questions. And then we test the prompting questions with this group, or these representative folks, because we want to say, do these questions, are they relevant? Do they make sense? And we will invite them to say, do these questions provoke experiences? When you read this prompting question, do experiences come to mind that seem relevant to the issue? And so it's a iterative process of coming up with questions that are relevant, that genuinely provoke experiences that feel like they matter, and and at the same time are ambiguous. So there's no right or wrong answers.
Yeah. So I really love that. That in the facilitated conversation, you'd be asking them about their experiences, and as they talk about them, you'd be seeing the patterns and pattern spotters. In general, what do you notice around this issue?
Yep.
What are the contradictions on the one hand, on the other?
Yep.
What has surprised you about it? What questions do you have about it? And as they do that, you're listening and you're seeing patterns. They're talking about patterns of their experience, and you're seeing patterns from the group. And then as you put together the questions, it consolidates those questions of the group. And then you confirm it back to them with their experience. So it really is an interesting pattern recognition, generation, confirmation process of meaning making. So it's not just sense making at the end. It's not just active sense making at the end. You're active sense making in the middle as well.
All the way through. I mean, you can
Hmm.
think about,
Hmm.
yes, adaptive action. It's what, so what, now what, within larger circles of what, so what, now in
Hmm.
larger circles.
Hmm. Yeah. And
Uh,
each time it's kind of distilling the information. So
mhm.
you can think about the experiences as raw materials, and that this is a process of distilling them and getting the essence out of them without destroying the essence of it.
Yeah,
Really interesting. So then once you have the questions and the stories are coming in, I'm very curious about how the storyteller tells you about their story.
yeah. Well, that's the
So they told you
next,
a story,
right.
and then they analyze it for you.
So then they tell us what it means, and again, the the premise behind this is that the only person who truly understands the meaning of their story is the person whose story it is. And that's one of the key points of active sense making, is that every voice matters, and every voice is taken seriously as being the authority. They are the expert on their story. And so the next part of it, we design prompting questions, but then we design not too long. It needs to be fairly short, but we design a series of what we call signifying questions. These are questions by which people give meaning or assign meaning. They say, this is what this experience meant to me. And even these questions, there's an art and science to them. They're graphic. There's three main types. There's a triangle one, where there'll be 3 points on a triangle, and people move a dot in between them to say where their story fit. There's what we call a slider, where they have two extremes on each end of the slider. And then we have one we call the marbles, where there's two axes, and people place a dot somewhere relative to each of the two axes. And it can be, again, they need to be ambiguous. And I'll give you an example of one. So here's one where for the inclusive education experience, so people were sharing stories, whether they were a parent or a student or a teacher. They were sharing, answering a prompting question about their experience with special needs education and inclusive education. And so think about this one. In the experience shared, so you're always referring it back to the experience that you shared, unique student needs were, and they have 3 points on the triangle: understood, taken seriously, acted upon. And all three of those could be true. And if you put the dot right in the center, you're saying all three of these points are equally true. But it may be that they were mostly understood, but maybe they weren't acted on so much. So you're deciding, and you watch people when they're doing this, they're moving the circle around trying to figure out where to put it. And they put it somewhere. The art of these is, if they're positive ends, which these are all slightly positive, you could argue, they're all positive. Or if they're negative ends, they're all negative, or they're all ambiguous. And there's always a choice, not applicable, to say, actually, Student
But you
needs.
don't want a pro and con to
No,
bias the data in one direction or another.
no.
Interesting.
So, for example, the experience shared was about school resources, student needs, student family. And that one's interesting because it's ambiguous. It may have been about that, but the fact is they may have not met it. It may have been about student family, but it was a total botched experience with the student family. So again, there's a certain kind of ambiguity. And so they answer those those are the triangles. A slider question is sort of a similar sort of thing. The experience shared was an example of, and you have usually two extremes: blind hope, total despair. Okay, and you can think about one end is total despair, one end is blind hope, and somewhere in between there maybe was where this story fit. And so, people answer these kinds of questions, and often there's some multiple choice questions, which then say the impact of the story that I shared was, extremely positive, neutral, extremely negative. So they give some impact things. Sometimes there's questions about the feelings in this story, the feelings that this story evoked to me or that was about. They can usually pick two or three feelings that, what things like made me feel angry, made me feel hopeful, made me feel whatever. And so they answer these questions. And then, of course, there's some demographic questions, whatever might be relevant, where you fit into the organization or age or whatever things, gender, whatever questions are relevant to the questions. So that's the interpretation. And so and those questions too, the design of those questions, by the way, when we're thinking of because you got to think about the cognitive load, so you can't have too many of these. And so these questions emerge out of the same workshops, because when we're listening to the people who are involved when we're creating the prompting questions, we're also listening to the kinds of things that seem to be impacting. So, for example, if we hear them talking a great deal, on the customer one about the customer loyalty, one of the things that was heard a lot of how customers were really happy when their questions got answered. Okay, when they received help for something in a timely and which makes sense, in a timely and relevant manner. And but so then you can design your triangles around some of those kinds of modulators, as you've heard those things come up as being the things that seem to matter in the community.
That is so cool. Again, it's another pattern recognition.
Yep.
And pattern distillation. So you hear what they say, and you say, these are the differences that make a difference in what they're talking about. Sometimes it's a triangle difference. Sometimes sometimes it's about the consequences of the story. Sometimes it's about the emotions. Sometimes it's about the content or the source. So interesting. And that idea about being able to sort is a fundamental cognitive capacity. That one of the first things kids learn, right? Is what's the difference between a cow and a cat? How do they sound? Or how do you sort these things by color or by shape or whatever? So that idea about being given three categories and asked, which does this fall into? Or what combination of do these fall into? It's just a really interesting, very deep and fundamental cognitive function. Then goes back again to one's perception.
Right. And when we're designing the instrument, part of the practice is that, we come up with a draft, and we send the draft out again to the folks who have been involved helping us to have these conversations. And we get their feedback. You're answering this, you're sharing, think of an experience and if they come back and they say these, a significant percentage of the questions have not applicable, then we say, well, those probably aren't very good interpreting questions if they're not applicable. And so they need to feel like they're relevant to the kinds of experiences that people would share. And so then, it goes out into the wild, and people respond and share experiences. And the nice thing about this, and this is really, I think, one of the unique differences between a active sense making and a traditional survey, So with active sense making, as I say, that every voice matters, every experience ends up being captured and contributing. The person, it's anonymous, and we're very careful about that. But nonetheless, my experience becomes part of the database, if you will, of this inquiry. And in a traditional survey, my experience is abstracted out. In fact, even when I answer the survey, whatever experiences are in my head from which, however, I'm answering the survey question, that experience is gone. It's no longer there. And my survey answer becomes it's lost too. It's nothing to do with me. It just becomes part of the average whatever out there. Whereas here, every single contribution from every single contributor becomes part of the interpretation and the story stay connected. And these have been done with as many as tens of thousands of participants, but every one is a story that's been interpreted. And then what you're able to do with Spryng, with the computer power of Spryng, is you're able to say, we have this quantitative data, which is all the patterns of interpretation, but they're always linked to the stories that generated them. So we can use statistical analysis to look at what are patterns, what are genuine patterns emerging, say, on this triangle. Where do all the patterns end up being placed? And we can cross-reference them. So we can say, we want to see all the patterns of experiences that were rated by people as being extremely positive and that happened less than a year ago, because that's another question. When did this happen? How long ago was it? Is there a difference between experiences 10 years ago and experiences this year? What did the ones that were positive, what are the pattern there? And so you see that pattern and you say, well, here, almost all of the positive responses to this triangle are in this corner, but there's a few positive ones down in this corner. I wonder what's going on down here. Most of them are up here, but there's a few down here. So then we can look at those, the ones at the bottom of the unusual triangle, and we pull up the stories and we say, here are those dots on that triangle, and here are the stories that go with those dots. And then you say, oh my goodness, is there something going on in those stories that's significant, why they're different than the ones? So you can always be looking at the qualitative data, the quantitative data, going back and forth, looking for relationships, correlations, and patterns of meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One of the tools that we use in complex systems is zooming in and zooming out, because we recognize that there are patterns at all those different scales.
Yep.
And so the fact that you can look at a whole collection of data and see a pattern, similarities, what's the same here, what's different, what's connected, that's how we define a pattern.
Yep.
So you see the data just as it shows up as its scatter diagram in whatever way. What's the same here? What's different? What's connected? And once you see it at that scale, then you can zoom into the story and say, for that story, in it, what's similar, different, connected that tells us about reality. Or you can look at those two stories that are nearby or two stories that are far apart.
Yep.
How are they same? How are they
Yep.
different?
Exactly.
How are they connected? And that's how the meaning comes about. And it's interesting that what you've done as you establish them is, what's the pattern, similarity, different, and connection in one experience?
Mm-hmm.
What's same, different, and connected across a whole person's experience? What's same, different, or connected for the group to define the signifiers? What's same or different or connected in the signifiers? And then what's same, different, or connected when you test them out?
Yep.
And then, yet again, when you say, this is what the data is, what are the patterns we see at this stage? What are the similarities, differences, and connections? What does that mean to us? And ultimately, how is that the same, different, and connected to what we understand about reality,
Mm-hmm.
about our own experiences and what we see and what we do? So it's pattern spotting and pattern creation and pattern reflection and pattern reinforcement, all in every
interaction,
which of course is the exchange, which is very exciting, I think.
And think about it, because
Interesting.
because you're able to cross-reference all of the different signifiers, all the different interpretive questions can be cross-referenced against one another. And that includes, for example, the demographics. So for example, we can look at what is the pattern of the teacher's experiences and the parents' experiences and the students' experiences relative to this question. This
Mhm.
pattern,
And how are they saying? That's a kind of
exactly.
meso system, right? And
Yeah,
how are they the same and how are they different?
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And so, and out of those, out of all of, as those emerge, of course, the instrument itself, the data itself, doesn't tell you what to do, uh, and doesn't tell the client what to do. But what it provides them with is insight into where it's reasonable to think of what would be in HSD terms the next wise action that's going to move us to where we need to go. So we're seeing these patterns, we're seeing these relationships, we start forming hypotheses. And this again is typically, this isn't the consultant who's doing this. This would be again gathering representative folks, sometimes the same folks who help create the instrument, sometimes different folks, but representative of the community that the study concerns, and giving them data, letting them play with this, and inviting their questions, inviting them to explore it. And it's curated because if you got 10,000, they can't look at everything. But the curation is relatively light. It's not. It's just saying these are patterns that emerge, and these are the stories that look like they go with. These are the stories that are connected to those patterns. What are you curious about? When you look at this, what are you curious about? And what would you like to explore more? And so they can actually dig into it and start teasing stuff out. And then you can, and typically inviting again uh, them to recognize, to ask questions about what's going on. What do they notice? Pattern spotters. Again, variations of pattern spotters is a very useful thing at this point as they're looking at all this stuff. And then the invitation is, so if there was hypotheses, if you were to, after all of this, and you're looking at this and you're to think, it depends who they are in terms of whether they can actually make decisions or they're just making suggestions. But nonetheless, to say, from this, what would be some hypotheses to get, to amplify the kinds of patterns that would be helpful and constructive and worthwhile, and to dampen the patterns that are the opposite of that, that would be unhelpful and that you want to put behind you. It leads to opportunities to 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 see things in a different light, and actually to know what you'd be endeavoring to, what the pattern is that you're endeavoring to shift. So for example, in a customer loyalty, we can say generally we want customers to be loyal. But now we understand the patterns of that loyalty. We can see what have been productive patterns, what have been destructive patterns to that loyalty. So we can actually start to say, here's a place, here's a modulator, here's a lever that we have, that we think if we make this action, take this wise action, it should have the effect increasing customer loyalty in ways that we think would be helpful. And actually, there's one study that I was thinking of before we had the conversation is a study of health providers, and they're looking at a particular community's experience of healthcare. And they discovered some really interesting different patterns between whether they were insured or not insured, and whether they had private insurance or insurance through their company. And that led to some really interesting opportunities for them to say, how could they shift the patterns? And they now continue to repeat the study, because they're saying, okay, we are taking some actions and we should see some shifts. We can continue to invite responses and get feedback through active sense making, and we should see if our theories bear fruit, then we will see patterns shifting in ways that we think are constructive.
Well, and it's fascinating because even at a more kind of analytical scalpel level view of the pattern, um, you can talk about there's this difference that shows up across the board and is a
Right.
difference we didn't expect to see. How can we use that difference? How can we, in our policies or our processes or our practices or our people or our training, address that particular difference? So you may not be talking about patterns of trust or patterns of communication or patterns of good customer service. You may be talking about this particular distinction between the people who are personally insured or professionally insured, and what is it at that particular intersection? And so you can be really precise in your active sense making in the now what stage.
Yep.
Because even ahead of that, you can say, oh, this is kind of like, and we've got this group, and we have an idea about what those do at a kind of um, impressionistic level, which is okay. But sometimes that impressionistic can represent your biases or somebody else's biases, or be so imprecise that you don't really know how to act. They can be perfectly accurate, true, but not precise enough really for you to be able to touch that point in the system, that difference in the system that can really make a difference.
Yeah.
And in my experience, sometimes the biggest change is made by the difference that's the least obvious. That you might say, you might not even have noticed the difference and might not even connect a difference with that pattern, with a pattern, emergent pattern. But that's the place where there's a lever and a possibility for change. So that I think would be a great thing to be listening for as you're doing the pattern spotters for the sense making. Because then what they're doing is to use the patterns that you generated and presented as mirrors to see
Hmm.
reality. And so
And
in that reflection, they see their reality in a much different and more articulated way.
that's actually uh, not uncommon that there's a surprise,
Mm.
um, that something little that it just hadn't twigged that would be important. And the insurance one is an example of that. That there was a significant perceptual difference how people were seeing if they had private insurance or they had company insurance, and that led to some insights. The other thing, though, that it does is often we do have intuition. The one that the public service, where the question we were looking at the experience of leadership, there were no big surprises in that. I think intuitively the organization had a reasonable sense of what was going on, but they didn't have data, and so with the active sense making, they're able to say we can see what's happening with how leadership is impacting. Authoritative leadership. Leadership experienced as authoritative as having this kind of an impact, and leadership experienced as collaborative as having this kind of impact. It's not surprising, but we have these stories, and we can see. We get a sense of the gravity of it, and it provides motivation to say, okay, there's an opportunity for us to address something here, and to make some amendments in how we develop leaders.
Yeah.
So,
It so shifts what the question is. And
mhm.
that's so key, right?
Yep.
Because you're going to whatever question you're asked is going to determine how you see the data, how you understand things, how then you take action.
Right.
And so if you can see differently, then it gives you a whole different way to move toward action,
Right.
adaptive action.
And as I have often said, the way that I came into active sense making and the way that I see it relating to my own practice in organizational development is, it's allowing me to do at scale what I typically do with my clients when at small scale. Um, and but if you've got hundreds of people, it becomes much harder to gather all those voices, to provide an opportunity for those voices to influence the system, and to be confident that you're seeing the patterns of the whole as well as the patterns of the individuals. And so it's very congruent with my individual work, but it allows it to happen at a larger scale.
This may be kind of a strange question, um, but is there anybody or any institution or any question that is not a Spring IO question? Is there any customer that you'd say that's a really important thing and it's not something we do?
I think I could probably tease just about any, if it's an intractable problem. I guess that's what I say. If it's being genuinely experienced as intractable, as having many possible answers,
Mm.
if it's and there being uh, serious. Well, I say serious, but obviously for them to want to do the initiative, it would be serious enough that they want to do something about it. To say, this is hard. This is hard. We have been working at this for a long time, and we're just not sure what the answers are. And I mean, all of my clients where I've done active sense making projects, they're coming at the end of having tried a lot of other things. Okay, often there are surveys, but they still aren't confident they're understanding what's going on. So Spryng becomes an opportunity to find out what's going on. So are there problems that you could not do? Are there problems that you would say not? I mean, I'm sure if somebody said to me, well, I may answer it a different way. If they weren't curious, if a client was simply looking to have their preconceptions confirmed to prove X or Y, I'd say Spryng's not the thing for you.
That's so great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Open for curiosity. Well, and it's interesting because that's the way we define a complex system, is that it's open.
Yep.
The boundaries are open and fluid, and
Yep.
certainly those are the kinds of issues you're working with. They're high dimensions, so there are lots of differences that make a difference, and you can't know ahead of time necessarily which ones they are. And it's nonlinear, so every cause is an effect. And those are our three characteristics for a complex system. And so it sounds like Spryng shines at things that are complex and intractable and not easy to solve in a closed system, low dimension, linear way, or by minds that are closed, low dimension.
Yeah, well, that's
linear.
but for me, the jury is out whether there are systems that are closed and linear, but there are minds that are definitely closed.
Yeah, I also think there are systems. Otherwise, my living room would not get so dusty.
Yeah.
But so interesting, so interesting. And when you talk about it, Barrett, I just see you glow and get excited and laugh and really enjoy this rich experience. And I've noticed that everybody I've ever seen engaged in a Spryng project or planning one or talking about one carries that kind of delight. I don't know whether it's hope or freedom or curiosity or, uh, but there's a kind of really positive energy. It seems to me. Do you notice that? Where do you think that comes from?
One of my longtime stock answers to when you're asked to introduce yourself in various events and situations. One of the ways I typically have described myself is incurably curious about what it means to be human. And I think Spryng is like a back scratcher to explore my curiosity about being human. Okay, it's a great tool for diving into that infinitely interesting pool of being human.
And you take a lot of people with you, which is great.
Well, as do you, Glenda. That's why one of the reasons I think we connect.